Okay, so for tonight's special presentation, our own Bonnie Martland is a retired Army veteran, a retired Temecula school teacher, and an esteemed artist. She portrays historical figures in the Historical Society's Notable Women of Temecula program. Bonnie, a long-term area resident, has helped our community in many ways, serving as past president on both the Temecula Valley Museum Board and the Temecula Valley Historical Society Board. She's an avid Civil War historian who has visited several of the battlefields and other significant sites. This evening, Bonnie will speak about a little-known commanding officer at Gettysburg, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Go for it. Okay. Okay, well, there's a quote from him up there, and there'll be a few as we go along, but he was quite a writer. It might seem strange that we're talking about a Civil War person here, but it sort of came about in a roundabout way. Rebecca and I were walking back from an event in Old Town. I don't know how long ago it was, almost a year ago probably. And I had some issues with my back. I had my cane over there and had knee surgery, and she had some dietary restrictions, and we're going, man, some people in this day and age, complain a lot about their aches and pains. And I said, people in the past didn't seem to do that. They had aches and pains, they just sucked it up and kept on moving. And that brought to mind the fellow that I'm going to talk about tonight. He is a Civil War general, but he came to mind because if anybody had right to complain about their aches and pains, it was the fellow we're going to talk about tonight, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I asked Rebecca if she knew who he was when I mentioned him. She said no, she had not heard of him. And when I told her a little bit about him, she said she might have had some relatives that went to the same university as he did and had some of the same religious convictions that he did. So even though he's from the far state of Maine, there might be a few of us that have some connections. Like I said, if a man ever had any reason to complain but did not, it was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And since we're meeting here tonight on February 24th, it's kind of ironic that on February 24th, 1914, that's when Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain died. He died from battle wounds he got during the Civil War, and he was probably the last Civil War veteran to die from his battle wounds. And I know this is not a Temecula story, but I think his story is relevant to tell because he is truly a unique American, and his story is one that may bring all of us as Americans to come to some reflections about what it means to be an American. Also, his story is about a man born into a very simple life whose faith, character, and determination raised him to great achievements. And I don't think his story should be forgotten. And as Jim mentioned, as a former Army officer and a former teacher, his story kind of resonates with me. February is also the month we honor presidents, and Abraham Lincoln, whose birthday we celebrated on the 12th, delivered his Gettysburg Address on November 19th in 1863. John, can you bring a handkerchief from my purse? A handkerchief. I took my Zyrtec, but I still have a drippy nose here. Yeah. So when I go to Gettysburg every year there's a program called the Lincoln Forum. It's for Lincoln scholars, and it's for Lincoln scholars, and I go there. It's the time of the year when they do a commemorative talk on the Gettysburg Address. They recreate it every year, and so Gettysburg was one of our first national military parks, National Military Cemetery. And when I was there this past November, I was listening on the 19th to that year's commemoration speech, listening to Lincoln's words. It made me think again about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, because he was one of those soldiers, both living and dead, as Lincoln said, whose bravery did much to ensure the Union victory at Gettysburg. Chamberlain's actions as commanding officer of the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment earned him the Congressional Medal of Honor for his defense of Little Round Top. The battle was a 3-day battle from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, and it was one of our most costly battles, not only of the Civil War, but of all time. Over 51,000 soldiers from both armies were either killed, wounded, or captured, or missing. What brought Chamberlain there? He was born in Maine, a little town called Brewer, Maine. He was called Lawrence as he was growing up, and he had a typically Spartan New England upbringing. His parents were sturdy Maine stock, very religious in the old Calvinist way. They raised their oldest son, as they did all their children, to embrace their religious ideals and beliefs, and faith for Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain would always be an important part of his life. As he was growing up, there was always a lot of work on the family farm, and one day he was plowing the field and he came to a big rock and his father said, "Move it." And Lawrence, as he was called, said, "Well, how? How am I going to move it?" And his father said, "Just do it. That's how." And that became his motto for the rest of his life, because it was kind of a lesson in determination and singleness of purpose. And it was something that he took to heart. Now, Chamberlain liked the outdoors. He liked hunting and riding horses and so on, but he was also a very academic young man. And he had aspirations to go to Bowdoin College. It was a classical university. Classical studies were important, and when he wanted to go there, he found out that he was deficient in a very important entrance requirement, and that entrance requirement was Greek. He didn't speak Greek. Yeah, how many kids growing up on a farm in Maine, would speak Greek? Well, he wanted to go to that college, and so what he did was take his father's message to heart and do it. That's how. And he locked himself up. He made a little spot up in the attic, and he spent the better part of a year up there and trained himself to speak Greek. He learned Greek. He was accepted into Bowdoin College, and he attended and started his studies. And I'm going to pop up a couple of slides here before I forget that we have them. Oh, that was supposed to be up there when we were talking about our back pains. Okay, here's a picture of Joshua Chamberlain. And we skipped over Lincoln. See, I'm not very good at this. Okay, here's Joshua Chamberlain as a Bowdoin student. And when he started as a student, he had one very daunting and embarrassing disability. He was a lifelong stutterer. And that was particularly difficult in an era when it was an age of oral learning. People did recitation and memorization and so on. So with the help of a sympathetic professor, he was able to overcome that disability. And when he sets his mind to do something, he really does it. He learned to speak 9 languages other than English fluently. I'm sure learning language was part of his overcoming his stutter. Let's see if I have a list of the language he spoke. So, yeah, Greek, of course, Latin, Spanish, German, Italian, French, Hebrew, Syriac, and I guess that's what they speak in Syria, and Arabic, yeah. So he's a young man. When he puts his mind to something, he could do it. Ironically, for someone that had a stutter, he became a professor of rhetoric, among his other things. Also, he was a professor of natural and revealed religions. When he graduated, instead of taking a job right away, he attended a theological seminary and graduated from there with the qualifications to become a minister. And he thought very strongly about becoming a missionary. In fact, his mother wanted him to do that. But when Bowdoin College offered him a job as a professor, he decided to take that instead. Chamberlain also had a love of music. When he was a kid, he joined a music school. He enjoyed singing with music groups, but he wanted to have an instrument to play to go along with his singing, so he decided to buy a bass viol. Well, he couldn't find a bass viol in his small town in Maine, and so he decided to make his own, which he did. It's sort of like a cello. And his wife kept that at the piano for, I think, all the time they had together. So he was always active in his family church, and he decided to take the position of choir director. He soon found, however, that his eyes were roaming from his music to the organist. The organist was Miss Frances Caroline, they called her Fanny Adams. I can see this better, but I can't see you. And the organist, Miss Fanny, was the pastor's niece. And she had an unusual story. She was born to a very wealthy family in Boston, But her father was old enough to be her grandfather, and so he decided to give her up to another family member at a very young age. I think she was like 4 years old. And so she came to live with her relative, and his name was Reverend George E. Adams of the First Parish Church in Brunswick, Maine. Well, Fanny was a very bright and willful young lady. There's a picture of Fanny up here. Oh, him as professor. There's Fanny. And one of the tasks she was given at school, they were assigned in class to write a composition using the verbs ending in ly. Now, knowing that the teacher disapproved of her humor, she wrote, "This is to certify, notify, exemplify, and signify my obedient disposition. And I hope that it will gratify, satisfy, beautify, and edify my teacher. And pacify, modify, and nullify his feelings of dissatisfaction toward me. And please do not exclaim, 'Oh, fie,' when reading this paper." So Fanny was a very smart young woman. She was a few years older than Joshua Chamberlain, but in her he found a good match. And as I mentioned, she could be a little coquettish, she could be flirtatious, but he was smitten. So they got married. They became parents of 2 young children. Here's Daisy. Her name was Grace Dupee, and his name, that's a young man there. I have a picture of my grandfather in a dress as well, so even into the 1880s, they would dress little guys in dresses with long hair there. So, and Harold Willis, and they called him Willis. They had a stillborn baby, and then right at the beginning of the war, they had a child that died as an infant, but he had these 2 young children of his grew up. So he settled into life with his wife, his 2 little children, and went to work as a professor at Bowdoin College in Maine. His settled life would take a rather startling change, an abrupt change in 1862, when President Lincoln called for 300,000 volunteers. Lincoln had thought perhaps the war would be a short-term affair, and when he discovered that that wasn't to be the case, he called for an additional volunteers. Now, Chamberlain had every reason and every excuse not to enlist. He had, at 33 he was at the time, he was older than most men that would enlist in the Union Army, and he had family responsibilities and responsibility to his college as well. But he said he felt it was his duty to go to heed President Lincoln's call. Here's a quote from him. "I feel this war, so costly in blood and treasure, cannot be won until men of the North are willing to leave good positions and sacrifice their dearest personal interests." He was born just 50 years after the founding of the nation, and the concept of union was very important to him. Sometimes I think that's a concept that's difficult for Americans today to understand. Both his grandfathers, for instance, fought in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and his grandfather fought in the War of 1812, and his father was in the local militia. But besides Fanny, there is now another young lady who comes into his life, and that lady was, you recognize this name? Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was the wife of a fellow Bowdoin College professor, Calvin Stowe, and she was working on her anti-slavery novel. You all know what it is, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the book was originally out in serial form, and she was giving readings of those serial pieces in her parlor and having discussions and so on. And those readings and discussions affected Chamberlain quite a bit. He knew that, I think it also probably influenced his decision to join the Union Army. He knew he was enlisting to preserve the Union, but he also was quoted as saying, "Freedom and slavery cannot live together." When Bowdoin College got wind of what Chamberlain was up to, his enlistment thoughts, they were not very happy, to say the least. The Board of Trustees was adamantly opposed to losing what they called their innovative, bright, and up-and-coming young professor. Hoping to retain his employment, the college offered him a position as chair of the Department of Modern Languages and a 2-year sabbatical to study in Europe. Okay, now that's not a bad gig, if you ask me. Well, Chamberlain took the 2-year leave, but instead of going to Europe, he wrote a letter to the governor of Maine offering his services to his state of Maine to serve in the Union Army, because again, he felt it was his duty and the right thing to do. So when 5'7" or 8" Chamberlain enlisted in the summer of 1862, he was described as an easygoing and amiable young man. Not everyone thought him capable of any military endeavors whatsoever. Thinking that this laid-back guy, they also described him as an ivory tower intellectual. They said he would not be up to the job, a military job. Here's a quote from a letter. It was written by Josiah Drummond, the Attorney General of the state of Maine. My dear Governor, have you appointed Chamberlain Colonel of the 20th Maine? His old classmates here say you have been deceived, that C is nothing at all. This is the universal expression here of those who have known him. And like I said, that was a letter from the Attorney General of the state of Maine. Many thought that a seminary-trained college professor and a choir director, nonetheless, would be the last sort of man to lead men into battle. Chamberlain seemed, as they noted, quote, too soft, too effete, and too lost in intellectual pursuits to be a man of action. Well, in fact, just the opposite would prove to be true. So, see. Apparently, being professor held some sway with the governor because despite the Attorney General's letter, the governor did offer Chamberlain the rank of colonel and the top position as colonel of the new 20th Maine Volunteer Regiment. And though he aspired to that position, he turned it down. He took the rank of lieutenant colonel and the position as second in command of the unit. He said, and he wrote to the governor that he had a lot to learn before he would be ready to accept the higher task and higher rank and position. And so he was prepared, and he also told me he was prepared to study and learn what was needed for him to succeed. So Colonel Adelbert Ames, a West Point graduate and a battle veteran, became the colonel of the 20th Maine. It's kind of interesting. I mentioned, I think maybe at the beginning, that Chamberlain might have been the last Civil War hero to die from his battle wounds. Colonel Ames would become General Ames, and he was the last surviving Civil War officer who died in the 1930s. That's kind of a coincidence. He was a tough commander who was very hard on the 20th. Now, the new recruits in the 20th Maine were rough Mainers. They were lobstermen and fishermen and lumberjacks and so on. And I don't think they were afraid of hard work, but they didn't like somebody telling them what to do, and they didn't like Colonel Ames at all. In fact, Colonel Chamberlain's brother, Thomas, was a private in the unit at the time, and he said, the first battle we're in, the guys are going to kill him. He didn't mince words. His brother would study, Chamberlain studied, his brother studied a long time along with him, and he became a lieutenant in the regiment. But in any event, Ames, despite what the men thought of him, he became a mentor to Joshua Chamberlain. And he studied with him, and he also, Chamberlain, set up study groups. He got with other West Point graduates and so on, and he even had his wife send him military manuals to study. They took a boat south to go to Virginia for their, a campaign, and one of the guys on the boat with them said, we didn't have time to get seasick, we were studying the whole time. So he did learn under Ames. He said it was difficult, but he worked hard to acquire the knowledge he deemed necessary. He said, I believe God is over all things, and he will put me where he wants me and where I ought to go. Okay. Now, the 20th Maine, as part of the 5th Army Corps, was held in reserve at the Battle of Antietam. So consequently, the first real test the men of the 20th came with the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, and there's sort of a photo of it, picture of it up there. And if any of you know about that battle, it was a tough battle for their first real experience. It was an ill-conceived battle. It had flawed leadership, and it led to the Army of the Potomac's greatest defeat, one of the biggest defeats of any Union army in the Civil War. The Union Army suffered huge loss of life as offensive after offensive, line after line was sent up against a stone wall at Marie's Heights, and the Confederates behind the wall just mowed them down. They'd send up more troops, they'd mow them down. It just went on and on. Chamberlain, seeing this from a distance at first, literally wept. And when it was the 20th turn to go in, they also tried to defeat Lee's army. Again, were unsuccessful. But Chamberlain spent one night on the field in the cold December weather, in the dark. The only thing that kept him from freezing in the intense cold was he got himself between two dead bodies of Union soldiers, pulled the coat over them, and so on. And they provided his only bit of protection from the intense cold and the spattering of Confederate guns that went on through the night. Throughout the bitter December night, the horror lit by blazing colors of the aurora borealis proved a rare and a very surreal sight, as they were so far south as, Virginia. It's rarely seen that far south. Smallpox killed thousands of men during the war, and 40% of men that got that disease would die from it during the war. And shortly after Fredericksburg, the men of the 20th Maine, and a preventive measure gone terribly wrong, were inoculated with a defective batch of vaccine. And consequently, the regiment was riddled with the disease, putting them out of action for several months. During the war, as I said, more men died of disease than they did from battle wounds, smallpox being only one of a number of diseases that ravaged the Civil War soldiers. It was a problem Chamberlain fought a number of battles with during his time in the service. Also, shortly after Fredericksburg, Adelbert Ames, and here's a picture of him there, was promoted to general and assigned to another division. And so now Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain became commanding officer of the 20th Maine, and in short order would find himself in the battle that would become the high point of his life at Gettysburg. In the summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia left Virginia, marched north through Maryland and into the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. His advanced troops ran into the dismounted cavalry of the Union cavalry of General John Buford's men. Under the new command of General George Gordon Meade, who you see on the screen. He was only in his mid-50s. He looks ancient in all his pictures. And they called him the old goggle-eyed snapping turtle because he always had that kind of defiant look, and he also had a quick temper. He was only given command less than a week before the Battle of Gettysburg. The previous commander wanted more reinforcements and so on. Lincoln refused, and so he said, well, I'll tender my resignation if I don't get more troops, and he accepted his resignation, and so he got the job. And as soon as he got the job, he found himself in this situation. Neither he nor General Lee wanted a battle at Gettysburg. It just kind of happened. The troops were going, there was like 10 roads that ran into Gettysburg, so when you're coming from that part of the country, you kind of are drawn there. And so Lee's troops ran into those dismounted cavalrymen of John Buford's cavalry division, and started the skirmish that would lead to one of the biggest battles in the Civil War. Now, the Union men, the cavalry were there. They were ahead of the main army. They were there by themselves, so he had to quickly call for troops to come up. He called for troops under John Reynolds. John Reynolds brought some troops up, and they were killed, but he was killed, the general was killed. But as the day went on, more troops were coming up to sort of build up the Union Army. But they were outnumbered vastly that first day. And so by the end of the day, even though they started out doing pretty well, Buford held his own against the Confederates at first. They were pushed back through the town of Gettysburg, and the Union men had to go. They deployed on a hill behind Gettysburg. They went through the town. You've seen pictures or heard stories of the things that the citizens in Gettysburg went through. One young lady was killed making bread and so on. So the troops there was fighting right through the town. The Union men pulled back and deployed behind the town. On the second day of battle, that crucial second day of the three-day battle, General Chamberlain and his volunteer regiment from Maine, including his younger brother, Lieutenant Thomas Chamberlain, found themselves defending a little hill called Little Round Top. It was a most dangerous place at a most dangerous time. They quickly realized, most likely, that the fate of the battle, so thus the fate of the Union, and thus the destiny of the United States, could be held in the balance in how they performed that day. Colonel Strong Vincent, as commanding officer, there you can see the Union men pulled up, see the blue in the formation of a fishhook. It's called the famous fishhook. Right there at the base of there is Little Round Top. Over here on this ridge was where the Confederates would line. It was about a mile in between. So these guys are on Seminary Ridge. These guys are on Cemetery Ridge. So Colonel Vincent, commanding officer of Chamberlain's division, had been called to the hill by my supposed relative. This is one reason I sort of got interested in this battle in the first place. Family lore has it that we are related to somebody named General Gouverneur K. Warren. General Gouverneur K. Warren. He was the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac. He didn't have troops of his own. But when the commanding officer found that he heard some noise down here. Okay. What did I do? Okay. Not good with. He heard the General Meade is up here. He heard some noise down this way. So he said to General Warren, go down to that little yonder hill down there and find out what's going on. And if there's anything needs to be taken care of, do it. So Warren went down there and he was shocked to find that Little Round Top was empty. So he got on top of the hill. He's looking out from here and he's looking over this way into the trees. And he couldn't see anything at first because of the tree line, but he had a unit nearby fire off a cannon shot. And as soon as the Confederate troops heard that cannon shot, they turned to see where the report was coming. And so in the trees over here on Seminary Ridge, he saw in the sun, the glint of the sun off the rifle butts and the sabers, of the Confederate troops. He saw the glint of their rifle barrels and their scabbards and so on. He realized that he was that this key spot, Little Round Top, at the left of the flank, was in imminent danger of being overrun by the Confederates. And if you have that area at the end of the troops, see how you could roll up the whole Union line? If you get on the end, you can roll it all up. So he sent immediately for troops to come up. And he sent, I won't go into why that was empty too much, but there was a general named Daniel Sickles who was supposed to be occupying that line, but he decided to move himself forward near the Emmitsburg Road, which was between the two there's a red line between the two lines there. I think that's the Emmitsburg Road. So he moved his men up there and left a great gap in the Union line up on the hill. So when Warren found that was empty, he immediately sent for someone to come up and take that position. So he ran into Colonel Strong Vincent, who is commanding officer of Lawrence Chamberlain's regiment. And Strong Vincent, he had several regiments. He had the 83rd Michigan, he had the 44th New York, the 16th Michigan, and the 83rd Pennsylvania, and the 20th Maine. So he immediately took them up to the hill, and he placed them. And he put all but the main men facing Seminary Ridge. He made the position just minutes before the Confederates came onto the hill with an onslaught. He, in turn, took the 20th Maine, put him at the very end of the line. Let's see if I can find another. Let's give it a one. Okay, so if you can see here, Strong Vincent put his 16th Michigan, his 44th New York, his 83rd Pennsylvania on the line here. They'll be facing these Texans and so on over here, the Confederates, the yellow. And here's Joshua Chamberlain in his 20th Maine. It's hard to see, but the hill actually bends around like this. And here's another part of the 20th Maine. There's a Company B here. And here's who he's going to fight, the 15th Alabama of Colonel Oates. Right here. Colonel Oates has more men. He has 2 divisions, Chamberlain, or 2 regiments. Chamberlain has 1. Now, when he was deployed on the hill, Chamberlain by Strong Vincent, he was told, hold that position at all hazards, to hold that line to the last. He warned them that if they gave way, the whole Union line might be rolled up and the battle lost. Now, Chamberlain had been quite ill. I told you he battled with illnesses during the war, and he had been isolated from his men for several days before the battle at Gettysburg. He was fighting dysentery, malarial fevers, and weakness, and so on, and his health problems were bothering him, but he put them aside as he got orders from Colonel Vincent. Colonel Vincent was a Harvard graduate, and when he gave Chamberlain his orders, he didn't realize that would be the last time Chamberlain would see Colonel Vincent. Desperately placing troops ahead of the Confederate onslaught on the other part of the hill, Vincent was killed as he was on a spur just off the edge of Little Round Top, helping the men from the New York, Michigan, and Pennsylvania units. Now, for a variety of reasons, I'm sorry I was a little disjointed there, but for a variety of reasons, the fighting on Little Round Top didn't start until almost 5 o'clock in the evening. It was about 4:45. And the fighting took place over a mix of open and wooded terrain covered with large boulders. The Union men piled up rocks and they found trees for protection. Now, smoke from guns laid low over the ground, adding to the late afternoon haze that was leaning into dusk. Fighting was loud, it was hectic, it was intense, and it was confusing. Now, Confederate Colonel William Calvin Oates here had 2 divisions. He had about 630 men. He was commanding the 15th and the 47th Alabama Infantry, and they occupied Big Round Top, which was just below Little Round Top. He wanted to stay on that and fortify that hill, but he was given orders to go off that hill and to take Little Round Top, just where Chamberlain's men were positioned. So they moved down the hill and up through the swale between the 2 hills and up Little Round Top and slammed into General Chamberlain's men. Chamberlain had approximately 350 men in his regiment at the time, the 20th Maine. So for over an hour and a half, the fighting was intense, with repeated charges up the hill by the Confederates. Chamberlain ordered everyone to fight, including musicians, cooks, guards. He had a group of men that were in his charge. They were other Maine men whose unit had dispersed. They had been there for 2 years and were to go home, except there was a number of men that had inadvertently signed 3-year papers, and so they were not allowed to go home. So they were, since Chamberlain was the only other Maine regiment in the area, they were turned over to him with words to the effect that if they don't work, you can shoot them. Well, he went to the commanding officer and said, I can't do that, But so he had guards for those men, and he took those guards. He even asked some of those men if they'd be willing to fight. All but three of them picked up arms when they could get them. They didn't have any at first. But as the fighting went on, and would fight with him. But he was really desperate to put everybody he had into battle. The Southerners made attack after attack up the hill, the Maine men battling them back. Both sides that day fought with increasing ferocity, with the 15th Alabama repeatedly charging Chamberlain's line. The piercing rebel yells added to the report of rifle fires, clashing metal, groans, of the men. The fighting on a number of occasions was hand-to-hand even. Chamberlain described it. The edge of the conflict swung to and fro with wild whirlpools and eddies. At times I saw around me more of the enemy than my own men, gaps opening, swallowing, and closing again, with sharp convulsive energy, squads of stalwart men who cut their way through us all around, strange, mingled, raw. How men held on, each one knows, not I. The changing tide of the attack with a stronger push on his left. I don't know if I can point it. If I'm the head of the hill and Chamberlain is here, he has men on the right and left flank. He had to pull his flanks, stretch them out, pull them back, and bend his left flank back almost to a V to protect the hill because the Confederates were coming up, swinging around and coming up on the side. That was made for a very weak line because he thinned it out, but he didn't have a choice. So he folded his line back at the right angle to protect his flank. Finally, facing the fifth attack of the Alabamans, he ran out of ammunition. He had been picking it up from both the Confederate soldiers and his own downed men and so on. They'd been firing things that were not real ammunition and so on, but they just had nothing else to fight with. So what is he to do? The Alabamians had gone back down the hill momentarily, but he knew he'd be coming back. So he had to come up with something. So in perhaps his most famous decision, Chamberlain called for his men to fix bayonets. Chamberlain hurriedly explained, as they could no longer hold the defensive without ammunition, they would use surprise and the higher ground to their advantage and charge forward toward the advancing Confederate line. Calling for bayonets, he had the left of his line swing around, so he's down here, swing around like a gate till it came down, abreast with the right, and then that regiment charged down the hill and swept the Confederate soldiers off the hill. Swept them down and swept them in its wake. Adding to the confusion, the maneuver caused the Alabamans to think that perhaps more Union regiment reinforcements had come up on the right. So the tactic was most unusual given the art of warfare in 1863 because bayonet fighting wasn't really something that was done during the Civil War. But it was a resounding success with hundreds of Confederate prisoners taken and the left side of the Union battle line secured. So the 20th men, going forward would now be recognized as a fighting force to be feared and to be respected. Chamberlain, who had been walking up and down the line, encouraging and directing his men, managed to survive the battle with only a glancing wound to the ankle and a bruise where a Southern bullet had hit his sword scabbard. He's very, very lucky. FYI, the Alabamians fled back toward the woods or back up toward the summit of Little Round Top. Now, years later, Colonel Oates insisted that he was ordering a retreat as Chamberlain was, sweeping down the hill. It may or not have been true, but it was true that most of his men surrendered to the men of the 20th Maine. The bayonet charge was unorthodox and an audacious move on Chamberlain's part, but it gave him the opportunity to accomplish what Colonel Vincent had ordered, to hold his position at all hazards. As noted, it was a great success born out of necessity. Chamberlain, even with his limited military training, understood that if he had failed, the line would have been flanked, and possibly, as Colonel Vincent had warned him, the Union line rolled up and the army routed. Now, controversies, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time because I'd rather tell Joshua's story, but over the years, some people have said, oh, he couldn't have, I didn't hear him, and some men in the regiment said, I didn't hear him say bayonets. Well, probably only the men closest to him heard it. But as men started to, it kind of swung down the line. They picked up what was happening and they went. Also, some other men, one guy named, I think he was a Sergeant Melcher, he had just asked Chamberlain if he could go ahead of the line and into some of the boulders that were on the hill to pick up some of their wounded men. And Chamberlain had told him to go back because he was going to, direct a charge. And so some men say, oh, Melker was the one that was, first out in front and so on. Well, over the years, men remembered things in different ways. There's a new book out on Chamberlain called On Great Fields by a man named Ronald White. And he was with us at Gettysburg this last time we were there. And his book on Gettysburg, he says that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had no issue with the men that saw things differently than he did. He said to them, you are all right, because everybody saw things from a different advantage point. With practical understanding that where a soldier stood in the field provided different perspectives, insight in what they heard, and also did the passing of time. So another little note, rushing down the hill near the colors leading the charge, Chamberlain was met by a Confederate sergeant coming up the hill who had his sword in his hand, put it towards Chamberlain's neck, pulled out what he called a Navy revolver, and went to fire it at Chamberlain. Now, I've read several things about what happened, because one said his gun jammed and he couldn't fire. Another one said he misfired and, he missed him. And then the latest book I read said that he said, a queer feeling came over me and I couldn't pull the trigger. So in any event, Chamberlain was spared, and Chamberlain took his sword, put it towards the man who surrendered, and became one of the hundreds of Confederate men that surrendered at Little Round Top that day. Now, at the end of the battle for Round Top, Chamberlain got orders to take his men and go up Big Round Top. There weren't men up there, but they didn't know that, and it was total darkness on the battlefield by this time. Remember, it was almost a night battle when they were doing Little Round Top. So one of the men that went up there said, one of the Mainers said he was more frightened going up Big Round Top that night in the total darkness, not knowing what was up there and what they might find, than he was during the evening battle at Little Round Top. Okay, so here's Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, his two brothers that were there with him. John Chamberlain, the youngest brother, is on the one with the bow tie there, and then his brother Tom, who started as a private, but was at this time a lieutenant in the 20th Maine, and then Joshua Lawrence. And John Chamberlain was there with the men because he was a Christian commissioner. He was with the Christian Commission. He was there to provide medical and spiritual aid for the soldiers. And so when he was there, he actually got to the position at Gettysburg before his two brothers, and he was talking with some of the men. They didn't know who he was, and the men in the 20th were saying how much they liked their commanding officer, noting that he worked hard to keep them fit and well on long marches, and that he pitched in to help when they had to build breastworks and so on. He took off his coat and pitched in with the men, and a great many Civil War commanding officers would not do that. Now, Confederate Colonel Oates, just as a note, also had a brother with him at Little Brown Top fighting that day. His name was also John, and he was also a lieutenant. He was ill, and so Oates asked him to remain back and not fight in the battle. He said he was an officer in the Confederate Army, and he didn't want to be thought of as a coward, so he participated in the battle, and he was killed. I'm going to pop through some slides here really fast. When I took some pictures in November when I was up at Round Top. Now you have to remember, this is November. The battle was in July. And so the scenery would be kind of different. But this is the side where the New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan men were posted. That little statue there is General Gouverneur Kimball Warren, where he stood. And you can see he looked out. You can see here's the trees where the Confederate soldiers would be. And there's the mile that they came across. Little Rocky Hill was a pretty big size boulders there. Now this is the side of the hill where Chamberlain's men were, and again the trees would have been leafed out. Of course, the new road, they just spent $10 to $13 million refurbishing this section of Gettysburg National Military Park. It's been closed for a couple of years, just opened this last summer. So looking toward Here's some of the breastworks here looking, whoop, did it again, oh. Okay. Some of the breastworks, and of course, there's Big Round Top, and there would have been no roads. Main marker. That gives you some of the left of the line, but you can see some of the terrain. And this is the 20th Maine's regimental marker, and Joshua Chamberlain was one of the men who helped decide where they would place that at Gettysburg, the right line. Now, this little rock, this big rock here, is a scene of an interesting thing. This is where Colonel Oates found his brother, John. He had been killed. But he also saw there a horrific attack. One of the Maine men had tried to get the colors from the Alabama color bearer, and another Alabama man took a bayonet and bayoneted the Maine fella in the head. So it was kind of a gruesome scene. So it looks quite peaceful today. It wasn't in July of 1863. Okay, I'm going to go back one for a minute. Okay, the third day of the battle, I'm not going to talk about, but just so you know how the battle ended, you all heard the story, what happened on the third day at Gettysburg? Pickett's charge, yeah. Yeah. So at the end of the day, the Maine men are still on their ridge, and the Confederates are on their ridge, and General Lee said he's going to break that Union line, so he sent 12,000 men straight up the middle, straight into the middle of the Union defensive, that fishhook, because he had, previously attacked both ends with no luck. So he thought, okay, this middle must be weak. They put all their men on the ends. Well, maybe barely half of those 12,000 men got back. It was probably Lee's biggest blunder, but that really ended the Battle of Gettysburg. And Lee went back, the next day or two, he was retreated and went back to Virginia among a large rainstorm. Now, right after this, Chamberlain contracted a very severe case of malaria, and that was not uncommon for men from the very northern part of the United States, to be in the South. He was found unconscious, he was weak, he was transported to a hospital where for a while his condition seemed to deteriorate. So he was forced to take leave for a couple of months. He didn't want to, but they sent him home, and when he came back to service, they put him on court-martial duty, which is basically a desk job. He was not made to be doing a desk job. He had his fill of desks. He had made comments during the war that he could never imagine himself back in a university setting, back in no more desks and paperwork for him. So when he returned to the battlefield, he returned in time for the Battle of Petersburg, late in the summer of 1864. Now at Petersburg, just outside of the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, Chamberlain was terribly wounded. Promoted now to a brigade command, his brigade found itself in a salient in the Union front. He was given the command to attack, and though accustomed, as you can imagine, to following his orders, on this day he was hesitant. He wrote, somebody came that he didn't know, an officer he didn't know, and gave him a verbal order to attack. And he questioned it, so he sent a message back. He said I am advanced a mile beyond our own line in an isolated position. In front of me at close range is a strongly entrenched line of infantry and artillery 8,000 strong, with a projecting salient to my left and to my right, such that my advance would be swept by a constant crossfire. In addition, there appears to be bad ground, swampy bog, where my men would be held at a great disadvantage under a destructive fire. So he wanted to say, are you sure you want me to do this? Go forward? So despite this, he was ordered again to attack. Under such circumstances, he thought he should dismount and lead the advance himself. So while turning to his right to direct an oblique movement of his advance, a Confederate soldier aimed too low. His bullet ricocheted off a rock and ripped up through Chamberlain's right hip and pelvis, producing a horrific abdominal wound. Fearing his men would lose heart if he went down, Chamberlain jammed his saber into the ground as a makeshift crutch, so he could, to help him remain upright as long as he could, as blood ran down both his legs and filled his right boot. And as weakness overcame him, he fell to his knees, and then he fell to the ground and he lost consciousness. His artillery commander, while observing the day's action through field glasses, a while later noticed that Chamberlain's shoulder boards, the boards he has, with his rank insignia on it, were down on the muddy ground, and he dispatched a team of 4 men with a stretcher to bring him back. Convinced that his wound was mortal, Chamberlain, when he came to, pleaded with the stretcher bearers to first see to others who were wounded less severely, because he was convinced that he was, not going to make it. The corpsmen, stretcher bearers, told him he was no longer in command and that they had been given orders to bring him back, and that's what they were going to do. And as this little to and fro is going back and forth, a nearby shell burst covered the little group with mud and debris, and there was no more discussion, and Chamberlain was taken off the field. By the time Chamberlain reached the field hospital, several hours had passed. The mini ball had entered his right hip, severed arteries, tore up muscle, fractured his pelvic bone, damaged his urethra, and involved the bladder. Loss of blood was severe. The prognosis was grim. I'm sure you will all know that Civil War surgeons, and surgeon, by the way, was the word for doctor. They weren't necessarily real surgeons as we know today, but it was their word for doctor. Civil War surgeons were very adept at removing limbs. But if you Chamberlain had what they called a gut wound, soldiers were usually left to die. Internal damage from mini balls, which are not mini, caused such extensive internal damage it was beyond the capabilities of most Civil War doctors to repair. And the time would have been extensive, and here they got other men coming that need help. When Red reached Tom, his brother, of Chamberlain's injury, and Tom was back with the 20th Maine. Here's a picture of Tom. He hurried to find 2 regimental surgeons from the 20th Maine, and they went from field hospital to field hospital with Tom till they found Joshua Chamberlain. The surgeons embarked on an unprecedented open wound exploration in the field hospital, with Chamberlain receiving morphine and chloroform for sedation. Now, let me remind you that Civil War field hospitals were dirty, messy, bloody, makeshift affairs. They were often even outside, out in the open, and anesthesia, for all intents and purposes, was non-existent. And it was an age without antibiotics or sterile preparations. Many amputees died from post-surgery infections, gangrene, and so on, not the surgery itself. So halfway through this operation on Chamberlain, the pain became so great that the doctors described it as sheer torture, and they decided they should lay down their instruments, thinking that the agony had gone on long enough. However, Chamberlain himself, who remained conscious, hard to believe how, encouraged them to continue, and they did, reconnecting several urinary organs and removing the mini ball that had done so much damage. Urosepsis, sepsis from urine, set in almost immediately, causing severe chills, high fever, convulsions, delirium, nausea, and vomiting. Hope for recovery was non-existent, as shortly after finishing, the exhausted surgeons noted urine exiting the lower wound. Well, the surgeons told him he wouldn't live. And so, believing his wound was mortal, he wrote the following letter to his wife, to Fanny. My darling wife, I am lying here mortally wounded, and the doctors think, but my mind and heart are at peace. Jesus Christ is my all-sufficient Savior. I go to him. God bless and keep and comfort you, precious one. You have been a precious wife to me. To know and love you makes life and death beautiful. Cherish the darlings and give my love to all the dear ones. Do not grieve too much for me. We shall soon meet. Live for the children. Give my dearest love to father, mother, Sally, and John. Oh, how happy to feel yourself forgiven. God bless you. Evermore, you precious, precious one. Ever yours, Lawrence. What a letter to write. On hearing Chamberlain's wound was mortal, General Ulysses S. Grant gave his only battlefield promotion to the rank of general. Chamberlain was promoted to brigadier general, and he was put on a litter, loaded onto an ambulance wagon, and had a bumpy, painful ride to be transported 16 miles to a hospital ship. And the hospital ship then transferred him to the Naval Hospital at Annapolis in Maryland. There, a General Gilmore noted, quote, he arrived booted and spurred, blood-soaked and smeared, hair and beard matted with blood and earth, pale as death, weak as water. He noticed Chamberlain's condition in a letter. His wound is severe. The ball severed the urethra so near the bladder that by no artificial means can all the urine be conducted without escaping and passing out of the wounds. It is feared that ulcers will form in the abdomen and terminate his life. Indeed, he did evacuate urine through that wound for the remainder of his life, and he did endure painful ulcers and infections as a result. Fanny, who had been in New York, came and helped with his care at Annapolis. And miraculously, when you hear all that was wrong with him, he began to show some improvement. And he was transported back home to Maine. His obituary with his promotion to brigadier general had been published in the papers and was among his favorite reading when he got back home. Yeah, said it was his favorite reading material as he worked to recover. Ironically, he would die from this wound, but not until his 85th year. Over the years, Chamberlain had numerous surgeries, and one was only a couple months later, still during the war. And he nearly died on several occasions as infections ravaged his body. He endured terrible suffering. He had to be helped mounting a horse, and he could only walk short distances. Sitting was painful. His wound complications evolved into an open sore behind his scrotum that refused to heal. His condition affected not only his health, but his finances. Surgeries and medical care were expensive. Health issues forced him eventually to step down from jobs he had and when he went back to civilian life. And it resulted in a loss of income, of course. However, he didn't decry his suffering, and he rarely spoke of it to others, which kind of brings us back to the first page about we may complain, he kept quiet. Home in Maine, his condition improved somewhat in the 5 months away from the battlefield. Fanny, his parents, of course, they all wanted him to stay home, saying, you've done enough, you don't need to go back. But Chamberlain insisted. He returned to the 20th, saying, there is no guarantee of peace at home or guarantee of death in battle. To him it was clear his fate was in God's hands, promising his family he would, quote, avoid any dangerous endeavors. I'm laughing because you're going to see what happens later. And though nearly all movement was painful, he still could not sit a horse. He returned to the battlefield. And he wrote a letter to his parents. He said, I owe this country 3 years' service, and I am not scared or hurt enough yet to be willing to face to the rear when other men are marching to the front. So back at the front, and back with the 20th Maine. When he was gone, there had been some shifting in the Army, so he's back with the 20th Maine at this point. Grant's Army gained a key victory at Five Forks at the section of the battlefield known as the Quaker Road, after a driving charge by Chamberlain and the 20th Maine. So much for him avoiding danger, right? Just at the beginning of that charge, a bullet struck Chamberlain's horse. His name was Charlemagne. All his animals had, classical names. Hit Charlemagne, went through Charlemagne's neck, hit Chamberlain in the arm, then hit him, glanced off his arm, hit him in the chest. It was deflected by a brass mirror and an order book in his coat pocket, and then the bullet went out the back of his coat and then knocked his lieutenant off his horse. As one historian noted, that was some bullet. Chamberlain slumped over his horse, bleeding profusely, when General Charles Griffin, seeing all the blood, yelled, "General, you are gone," meaning, you've had it. Just coming to consciousness, Chamberlain misunderstood, and seeing his 20th Maine troops ahead, said, "Yes, General, you are right," and took off in the direction of his men, trying to get in front of them, to take up his command again. Attempting to find his way to the front in the confusion and the battle haze and so on, he rushed into a pocket of enemy who drew their weapons intent on taking him prisoner. In his best Southern accent, he said, "What's the matter with you all? What do you take me for? Don't you see those Yanks heading on up north? Come with me and let us break them." Now, Chamberlain knew 9 languages and was a master of accents, and it saved him here, along with his quick wits. His dried mud and blood-soaked shirt probably also helped a lot. And supposedly he led the Southerners right back into the Union line where they were taken prisoner. Now, the latest book I read mentioned everything up except for the Southern drawl part, so I don't know. I can't swear to that part, but it sounds like, I like to believe that it's true. I do know that the injuries to the rider and the horse, as well as General Griffin's comments and so on, are all true, and they've been well documented. And I also know that Chamberlain rallied his troops, made a counterattack, and by that evening he had control of the sought-after junction of the Quaker Road, and he had turned over a large number of prisoners. And for your information, Charlemagne, a broken down and abandoned Confederate horse that Chamberlain had rescued, it had been full of sores and so on, had obviously been a pack horse for the Confederate Army. He nursed it back to health, and he would recover from his wounds, survive the war, and he went home to Maine with Joshua Chamberlain. So I thought you need to know that. Tell something about Chamberlain, I think, too. And I also know that it was his bravery at the Quaker Road at Five Forks that earned Chamberlain the breveted rank of Major General. Five Forks is sometimes called the Waterloo of the Confederacy, and Lee's army was in a bad way, and here he lost even more, a great many of his men. It was just very near the end of the war. Things were finally looking up for General Grant's army, and there was an atmosphere of elation and high spirits running through the Union Army at this point. But the high-spirited atmosphere was, for Chamberlain, tempered because of an incident there that happened to one of his men. Years later, he would still recall the 20th Maine's Major Glenn. He had ordered Major Glenn to kind of rout out a little pocket of Confederates that were holed up and were putting up some resistance. So Major Glenn climbed to the top of a little hill, a little rise, and he was shot dead as he crested the hill. Looking into Chamberlain's eyes with some anguish, surprised, he was laying there mortally wounded, and he looked at Chamberlain and he said, "General, I just did what you told me to do." And Chamberlain was just crushed. "Oh, my orders were never worth your life," he said. And that moment haunted Chamberlain for the remainder of his life. Another similar moment that happened to Chamberlain that tells about the same thing of his character. He came early into the war across a Confederate soldier leaning against a tree. The Confederate soldier was a young man in his teens. He had a little missalette open on his knee to some favorite Bible verse. And Chamberlain said, "He was dead, this boy, of barely 16 years. He was my enemy, this boy." And he lived with the image of that dead boy forever. And moments like that caused one of Chamberlain's officers to say, "General, you have the soul of a lion and the heart of a woman." And that observation, I think, like I said, tells a lot about his character. When Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. The war it really ended exactly 4 years after it had begun. And I think most all of you know that General Lee was given very lenient conditions by General Grant. He fed his army. They were able to take their mounts and rifles home, and some of their handguns home, and so on. But one thing that General Grant did require of the Confederates was some kind of a formal ceremony where the Confederate soldiers would surrender their arms and battle flags, their muskets, and so on. So out of all the officers in the Union Army, General Ulysses S. Grant, by way of General Griffin, selected Major General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain to accept the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. And this happened, I think, 3 days after the Lee and Grant signed the papers. No one was to know exactly what was going to happen. Something like that had not happened before, so they weren't sure how it was going to transpire. As the somewhat humiliated Confederates approached the surrender spot to surrender their arms and battle flags, at the sound of a bugle, General Chamberlain ordered his men, as the Confederates came into sight, to give them what he called the marching salute. So they'd been standing, at a relaxed stance. So he ordered them to take their guns, pull it up, and salute the Confederate soldiers. Chamberlain's point of view was that once we buried the swords and shook hands, the country could go back to being one country, writing words later to the effect is, "I don't know who it was that deceived these men and led them astray, but we can certainly lead them back home." It should be noted also that Chamberlain's gesture was taken very well by the Confederate soldiers. However, there is one exception that maybe some of you know about. There was a Confederate General Wise, who was a former governor of Virginia, and he was making some kind of noise during the ceremony. The surrender was given from General Chamberlain to Confederate General John Brown Gordon, who was, head of the Southern troops at the time. And Gordon, when he saw the salute, he ordered his men to give a salute to Chamberlain's, forces, all the Union soldiers in return. One Confederate general was not really willing to do this, so Chamberlain went to talk to him, just General Wise, and General Wise said, "You may pardon us, but we don't pardon you. I hate you, sir." And also he had some criticism from some Northerners who disagreed with his showing any respect to Confederate soldiers at all. Years later, however, many Confederate veterans still talked about the moment of respect with gratitude as they gave up their arms and battle flags, many of them weeping unashamedly. Chamberlain described the scene. On they came with the old swinging route step and swinging battle flags. Before us, in proud humiliation, stood the embodiment of manhood, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, with eyes looking level into ours. Waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into the Union, so tested and assured? On our part, not a sound of trumpet, not a sound of trumpet more, nor a roll of a drum, not a cheer, nor word, nor whisper of feigned glorying. No motion of men, but an odd stillness rather and breath-holding, as if it were the passing of the dead. Chamberlain sometimes was criticized for saying, did it really happen that way? Maybe you're making it up, you're a good writer. 10 years later, he met with Confederate General John Brown Gordon. He was speaking in New York, and neither one of them knew each other's writings. They had written basically the exact same thing, and he invited Chamberlain to come up and sit with him on the dais as he gave his talk. After the war, Chamberlain was elected governor of Maine. Oh, I have not been faithful here. There's Fanny. That's where he was wounded at Petersburg, Appomattox Courthouse. General John Brown Gordon. Okay, after the war, he was elected governor of Maine in 1866 and served for 4 one-year terms. Maine is one of the few states, maybe the only state I ever heard of that had one-year terms for a governor. And coincidentally, William Calvin Oates, the Confederate officer he fought on Little Round Top, became governor of Alabama, and John Brown Gordon, Confederate general of Appomattox, became governor of Georgia. And I think Delbert Ames also became governor in Mississippi or someplace like that. In 1871, Chamberlain went on to become president of Bowdoin College, and he later took office when he had to resign as president because of his health. He was given the office of surveyor of the port of Portland because they figured he didn't have to really be there to do anything. He could, it was almost but he appreciated the appointment. Although he had great success after the war, he viewed his war years as his greatest success. He and other members of the 20th Maine regularly gathered to remember their fallen comrades and to relive their battle experiences. And he traveled often to Gettysburg many times during his post-war years. In 1893, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his great heroism and his great tenacity while holding his position on Little Round Top, and again repeated assaults on Little Round Top against repeated assaults and carrying the advanced position at Big Round Top. He has 2 medals here because he was given one in 1893. Congress reissued the medals in 1904, and so everybody that had previously gotten a medal got a new one. 1882, I started to mention, was when he and the other fellows decided where to put the battle marker for the 20th on Little Round Top. Perhaps his greatest post-war achievement might be his writings, through which he sought to make peace with the war. Where is the reckoning for such things, and who is answerable? Was it God's command we heard, or his forgiveness we must implore? He wrote so compellingly, more compellingly than most men, and he thought more deeply about what the war meant and what all wars mean, and why men would stand to such an incredible fire. He said, "There is a way of losing that is finding when soul overmasters sense, when the noble and divine self overcomes the lower self, when duty and honor and love, immortal things, being it the mortal perish. It is only when a man supremely gives that he supremely finds." In the decades after the war, he loved to talk to veterans, and he always told them that they were heroes. Heroism is latent in every human soul and transcends the self, and it has immortalized you, he said. He was, in a sense, a spokesman for those who had passed through the hell of battle. He often went back to Round Top, and here's Joshua's second from my side over here with a straw hat. His son's behind him. I recognize him. I'm not sure if it's Fanny and his daughter or not in that picture, but he's there at Little Round Top. Now, Chamberlain lost his wife Fanny in 1905. After the war, they had a really difficult time. If there's any battle veterans here or military people here, I think they would understand. He had a struggle when he got home to adjust to civilian life, and she had trouble understanding what he had gone through. And since she was given away as a child, she had a complicated personality and rarely interferes about being left alone. And yet, he often felt compelled to leave her alone because of a call to duty, not only during the war, but after. For instance, when he was governor of Maine, there was no governor's mansion in Maine, so he was in Augusta doing the business of the state, and she was home. His Petersburg injury made marital life really difficult, impossible at best, and his pain was chronic. He was young when he went home, but obviously could have no more children. They had, like I said, one had died in infancy after he began the war, but no more after that. And he gave her a bracelet for their 10th anniversary. That's him, he was asked to speak at Lincoln's 100th birthday. He gave Fanny this bracelet for their 10th wedding anniversary, and it depicted the battles, the 24 battles in which he had fought. As Fanny aged, she became blind. She grew increasingly blind as she got older, and she also had a problem with depression, which grew more strong as her eyesight diminished. But eventually they were able to overcome most of their difficulties, and they were married nearly 50 years. She died a few weeks short of their 50th wedding anniversary. And like I said, some critics of Chamberlain, it's become more fashionable lately to question whether he told the truth about everything. But my friend and author, who wrote the latest biography on Chamberlain, said he's lived with him for 6 years when he was writing about Chamberlain, and he scoured every document he could. He even scoured his theological seminary notes. He found those, and he said that he believed what Chamberlain wrote was the truth as he saw it. And that really didn't change over the years. As he gleaned information, he may have added some things, but basically it didn't change. He believes his writings were truthful. And in my opinion, Chamberlain was shown to be a humble man in many of his endeavors, with a devotion to his religious beliefs, code of honor, and desire to do what is right. And that does not, to me, equate with a man writing for self-aggrandizement. His honors and promotions during his service speak to his actions on the battlefield. And during his service, not being a career officer, he did not play up to higher command, and he often did speak for those in humble circumstances. For instance, when the Maine soldiers under arrest needed help, he spoke to the governor on their behalf and so on. He came to their defense. And later, after he was governor of Maine, there was a constitutional crisis in Maine where, very similar to something that's happened nationally not too long ago, one man elected governor contested the others. The votes were so close. And they couldn't decide who was going to be the next governor of Maine, and both parties were, bringing troops to the state capitol, and it was a big crisis. So they called on Chamberlain to come settle things down until the votes and so on could be sorted out. So he was a man who people looked up to and trusted. As a former teacher, I chuckled at Professor Gary Gallagher. He's a very prominent Civil War historian. His remark about Chamberlain was, "If for no other reason, I admire Chamberlain because he is an academic who could perform in the real world." And that I like that one. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain died of complications, primarily infection from his Petersburg wound, on February 24th, 1914. He had developed severe nerve disease related to his abdominal wound, which made his last months extremely, extremely painful. He had always refused opiates, to which so many Civil War veterans became addicted, and he continued to do so despite his severe pain. Dr. Abner Shaw, one of the two doctors who had done the field surgery on Chamberlain at Petersburg 50 years previously, was at his side. He was his long-time physician. Also at his side was his daughter, Daisy. His son tried to get there but didn't quite make it. He got there a few hours late. Now, Chamberlain had survived smallpox, heat stroke, malaria, typhoid, and tuberculosis. His horse had been shot from under him 5 times, and 6 times he had been hit with rebel lead, causing the obituaries to be sent to the New York Times on 2 occasions. His most devastating I can't talk anymore. His most devastating injury was the pelvic wound, of course, the complications of which he endured for almost 50 years. Despite this medical history, he engaged in numerous skirmishes and 24 battles, his men capturing 2,700 prisoners and 8 battle flags. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his effort at Gettysburg and was subsequently promoted to Major General for his bravery at Five Forks. He served as governor of Maine for 4 terms and held a distinguished post-war career as a dedicated public servant. As one of Maine's most influential citizens, he was called upon to guide the state in time of crisis. His Christian faith and sense of duty and patriotism were all at his core, and he was a man of honor who conducted himself with dignity and humility. The former theology professor became one of the most remarkable soldiers ever to serve this country and one of America's greatest heroes. And he was a citizen soldier. He wasn't a, career officer. It's our American tradition. Chamberlain often had to recline to work as his old war wounds made sitting painful, and sleeping was difficult because of constant pain that kept him awake. His health deteriorated over the years and prevented him from attending the 1913 50-year anniversary ceremonies at Gettysburg. Although he had been to Gettysburg several times earlier that year to help with preparations. To him, the battlefield, and especially Little Round Top, was almost a sacred place, and he wrote, "In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear." I think I have this up there. Oh, maybe not. Yeah. "In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear, but spirits linger to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls. Generations that know us not and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream, and lo, the shadow of a mighty presence shall wrap them in its bosom, and the power of the whole of the vision shall pass into their souls." Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So Gettysburg National Military Park, as I mentioned, just went under a big renovation. So if you're inclined to go, you can see where so many men fought so bravely to preserve our Union, and you can see where, as Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain said, great things were suffered and done for you. Yeah, so that's it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, any questions?
At least eyes are still up for the most part. I hope. I know.
I saw the picture of you by that big statue of Abraham Lincoln. Who's the horse? Was that Charlemagne or was that just Lincoln's horse?
That's whatever horse Lincoln had at the time. So
That was just Lincoln's
that
horse.
was Lincoln's horse.
Okay.
And Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain saw Lincoln in Virginia, and he said they put tall Lincoln. He said he was so much taller than everybody else, even with his hat off. They put him on a short horse, and they said all the men could do was keep from laughing because Lincoln's feet were almost, touching the ground. Yeah, but I thought, Charlemagne, he had other horses, but even his dogs had, like Julius Tiberius Caesar, names like that,
Any others?
Got to be one Civil War question out there, right? Yeah.
If my math is right, he lived 49 years after the war ended. 1865 to 1914, that's like
1914.
amazing.
Can't be. Must have been. Oh, the war got out in 65 to 19. John, you're a math person. Is it that long? I can think in visual things. I can't think in numbers. Yeah. Yeah. So, it's pretty amazing. There's no guarantee he was the last survivor, but he's probably certainly the last officer to survive a battle like that. Yeah. No questions?
Hi.
Copy one.
I got one. Over
Okay,
here.
who's got one? Yeah.
I assume you've seen the movie Gettysburg.
Oh, yeah.
What did you think about the representation of Chamberlain in that movie?
If you go to Gettysburg, everybody thinks Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is Jeff Daniels.
Right.
Yeah.
Did they do okay in your opinion? or-
Yeah, they did okay. I mean, obviously they have fictional characters. They changed some things around, but they did a decent job. And some people ask, in that movie, there's a speech where he talks to the men of the Second Maine that were prisoners that were given to him and so on. He really did talk to them. He maybe didn't give that particular speech, but he did speak to him. And he was thought highly of. I mentioned his brother found out something, but when he was with other troops besides the 20th Maine, before he was put on sick leave, they spoke highly of him too. So yeah, he was a pretty decent guy. Yeah. And I sometimes think that, I know it's not a Temecula story. There's a paragraph I had in there I didn't relate, but I sometimes think that people think history's just dates. And as history people, we know history isn't just dates. It's the story of people. And we need to go back sometimes and revisit some of those stories, because what they even if it was a regular, normal life, didn't do great things like Chamberlain, what they did has given us what we have today. And I think it's nice to go back and visit some of those stories. Scott, yeah.
Thing that bothers me a little bit today is how certain people want to classify the Southern fighting soldiers as traitors. And sure, they were, opposite sides of the battle and the war, but they were pretty much pardoned at the end of the war, and their action was pardoned. And so, I don't know, to me, I think they're all Americans. We just had a war. There was one side and two sides. But once it was over, they were pardoned. And, like they said, bring them back in as Americans.
That's what Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain said when the guns are put down. Yeah, when it's done, it's done. I will say that the Lost Cause grew up after the war. The Southerners were the most, I won't say, they did the most writing right after the war, and they did champion the Lost Cause. And it became kind of one-sided. But, as the 1880s came in, a lot of the Union soldiers that had fought these men, they looked at them as their heroism wouldn't be complete if it wasn't for those that they fought on the other side. So if their heroism was great, they had to fight great people. It was a match of what was on the other side, and so they didn't denigrate them. But I do think some of the stories from the Lost Cause writing needed to be corrected later on. And I do agree that they are changing now names of Army barracks and so on instead of Fort Gordon. It's and so on. We had a lot of posts and even things at West Point, avenues and things that were named after Confederate generals. And I do think it's time to let that go. There's another thing that always comes up about, do we display statues of Robert E. Lee and so on, and Confederate generals and that. I think you display them, but put something on them to explain why they were put up in the first place, what caused this to happen. You can't take away statues of Confederate generals and so on and pretend the war didn't happen or that the South didn't secede. You need to use it as a teaching point. We have a...
I was just so afraid that, when all that stuff was being taken down, the next step would be Gettysburg. And we've been through Gettysburg. Boy,
Well, you have to be careful. Yeah. It can swing like a pendulum. There's a statue that was taken down of Lincoln helping up slaves because black men were, leaning out. It can go You know, you have to be careful. It can swing way over. But you need to use those. You can't erase history, but you can tell both sides of it and use it to explain what happened. Yep.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on that. I think changing the name of military posts is very much okay. I mean, the whole idea of that is not honoring these people. No one's saying it's history. No one's saying they weren't Confederate generals. It's just not honoring them. And in my recollection of the pardoning of them, wasn't there a constitutional amendment that barred the Confederates from holding federal office? But it might have been a law. I can't remember. But it had provisions where Congress could pardon people or allow them to hold public federal office, and Congress did a kind of a unilateral thing where they allowed enlisted people, not officers, but enlisted people, as I remember, in federal office, something like that. Could be not quite right on the specifics, but it was something like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know there was a problem with Confederate battle flags, that they wanted them back, and for a long time they were, the Congress refused to have those authorized to go back. They finally did. I think it was about 50 years after the end of the war, they returned the Confederate battle flags. But it was difficult for men that went through that period to not hold a grudge. It's only slightly related, but my grandfather. My dad fought World War II. He fought the Japanese in the Pacific. And for years, John and I had Japanese students that came and stayed. Yeah, so did you guys. Came and stayed with us. And we took them to home. And my dad was very generous and gracious and so on. But my grandfather had a hard time forgiving. And I guess in the 50s, there was Japan became Miss Universe. And my grandfather almost lost it, because how could we do this after what the Japanese did to, like, it would have been his daughter, but his son's generations. They had a hard time forgiving that, and there was some of that obviously going on after the war. Yeah.
As a statement, I grew up in Florida,
Uh-huh.
and in the 30s and 40s and 50s, we had two Memorial Days. We had the nation's Memorial Day, and we had the South's Memorial Day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. South is very proud. My mom and my dad was stationed in Florida when he came back from New Guinea after the war. He was sick, and he was sent to Florida for a while. My mom went out to get milk from the milkman. Milkman was black, and she started talking to him. She said, "I can't talk to you. It's not allowed." So even that recently, stuff was going on. When I was in the service in Alabama, there's still stuff going on. It is a culture that is, it's still evolving, yeah. But in Vicksburg, which also fell the same day Gettysburg did, the siege of Vicksburg, July 4th, 1863, they wouldn't celebrate 4th of July in that city for, I don't know, over 100 years, I guess. Yeah.
What was the total number of people who passed and died due to the war?
The whole war?
Yes.
That's a low estimate, yeah. And I would think over 600,000 Union. There were so many men. I think it's getting close to 1 million up now. Because so many men died from not just what happened on the battlefield, but things related.
Yeah, you mentioned how many of them
issues.
died of smallpox.
Yeah.
So I was wondering that total number of about 1 million probably included.
Yeah,
the
they'll
ones
say
with small-
less than that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's close. It's got to be up around 9. When I was growing up, it was 6 something, and then they're saying 700 something, and so I would think it's going up. What does it say there?
It says that it's between 620,000 and 850,000.
Yeah, and I think again, that's ones they know about. Yeah.
I think it's more than all other wars combined.
Yeah.
Casualties, U.S. casualties.
Yeah, for 4 years, just a short amount of time to have such a cataclysmic effect on the country. Yeah. But anyway, that's my.
I don't need Okay, what I found was interesting about this, the smallpox, the bad bio of the smallpox. George Washington inoculated his men for smallpox because, like you said, more people were dying of disease than in the war.
Yeah, the vaccination was, the procedure was perfected, and, well, it was perfected, but I know Benjamin Franklin inoculated one of his children, and the child died. And they said in the war, most soldiers were given inoculations as they were getting ready to go, in their first base camp. But the 20th Maine, for some reason, wasn't. And so they were given the inoculation later, and it was a bad batch. Yeah.
I'm always more interested about the women. What did Fanny die of?
Who?
Fanny, his wife?
Oh, Fanny. I'm not exactly sure, but she was kind of she had depression, and she was older than him. I think she had a weak heart. She kind of went within herself, kind of diminished as she got older, and her kids and the people would call her Little Fanny and Little Mom. I mean, she was kind of shrinking. Yeah, exact cause I can't say, but I know it was an ongoing something for a long time. It wasn't a sudden effect.
How old, do you know, more or less, or did she live as long as,
He lived out, she died in 1905, he died in 1914, but he was a couple years older than her.
Oh.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, what a fantastic, very interesting story and presentation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.